The story of Iran in the Bible does not begin with mighty kings or sprawling empires. It starts much earlier in the book of Genesis with the very first families of the earth. After the great flood, Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, became the fathers of all the nations. The Bible gives us a detailed record of their descendants, often called the Table of Nations. This is not just a dusty list of ancient names, it is the foundational map of how God saw the world populating and spreading out. Within this list we find the earliest ancestors of the people who would one day form the nation of Iran. 2 names are particularly important for our story: Elam, a son of Shem, and Madai, a son of Japheth. These names point to the very first peoples who settled in the lands we now call Iran. Elam was the firstborn son of Shem, the same family line from which Abraham and the nation of Israel would later come. This makes the ancient Elamites cousins in a sense to the Hebrew people. The descendants of Elam settled in the region east of the Tigris River, in what is now southwestern Iran. This area became known as Elam, and its people, the Elamites, built a powerful and enduring civilization. For centuries they were a significant force in the ancient Near East, often interacting with their neighbors in Mesopotamia. Their inclusion in the lineage of Shem is a vital detail, reminding us that from the very beginning God had his eye on this people group, and had woven them into the fabric of human history from the earliest days. On the other hand, we have Madai, who was a son of Japheth. The descendants of Japheth were generally understood to have migrated north and west, populating Europe and parts of Asia. Madai's descendants are widely identified as the Medes, a powerful people who settled in the mountainous region of northwestern Iran. The Medes would later become famous for their military strength and for building a vast empire that preceded the Persians. It is fascinating to see how God brought together 2 distinct family lines, one from Shem and one from Japheth, to inhabit the land of Persia. This shows us the beautiful and complex tapestry of God's plan for the nations, bringing different peoples together to fulfill his purposes in a specific geographical location. So when we read the Bible, we must understand that Persia, or modern-day Iran, is not a latecomer to the story. Its roots are planted firmly in the Book of Beginnings. The people of Elam and the people of Media were not just random tribes, they were specific descendants of Noah placed in their lands by God's sovereign hand. This biblical foundation is crucial because it sets the stage for everything that follows. God knew these people from their inception. He watched them grow from small family groups into powerful nations. And he had a unique and extraordinary plan for them, a plan that would see them intersect dramatically with the story of his chosen people, Israel. From their ancient beginnings, the descendants of Elam and Madai grew into significant powers. The Elamites, located in the plains of Khuzestan in modern Iran, established one of the world's oldest civilizations. Their capital, Susa, would later become a key city in the Persian Empire and the setting for the Book of Esther. The Elamites were often in conflict with the kingdoms of Mesopotamia like Babylon and Assyria. The Bible mentions them as skilled archers, a formidable military force. In the book of Isaiah, they are listed among the nations that God would use to judge Babylon. This shows that even in the Old Testament, long before the rise of Persia, God was actively using the people of this land to carry out his divine will among the nations of the earth. The Medes, descendants of Madai, emerged as a dominant force later on. They lived in the rugged, mountainous terrain of northwestern Iran, a land that shaped them into hardy and resilient people. For a time they were subjects of the powerful Assyrian Empire, but they eventually rose up and, in alliance with the Babylonians, overthrew the Assyrian capital of Nineveh in 612 BC. This event was a major turning point in ancient history. The Median Empire became one of the great powers of its day, controlling a vast territory that included all of modern Iran and parts of Turkey and Afghanistan. Their strength was so renowned that the prophet Jeremiah speaks of the kings of the Medes as instruments of God's judgment. The rise of the Persians is a story of a subject people becoming masters of an empire. The Persians were closely related to the Medes, and for a long time they were the junior partners in the Median Empire. They lived in the region south of the Medes, in an area called Persis, which gives us the name Persia. Everything changed with the emergence of a visionary leader named Cyrus the Great. Around 550 BC, Cyrus, a Persian, led a successful rebellion against his Median overlord. However, instead of destroying the Medes, he united them with the Persians. This Medo-Persian alliance created a new superpower that was unlike anything the world had ever seen before, combining Median military experience with Persian administrative genius. This union of the Medes and Persians is incredibly significant in the Bible. The prophet Daniel, for instance, repeatedly refers to the law of the Medes and Persians, which was known for being unchangeable. This reflects the dual nature of the empire's foundation. The two peoples were so intertwined that they were seen as one entity. This new Medo-Persian Empire under the leadership of Cyrus would soon expand to become the largest empire the world had yet known. It was this empire, born from the ancient roots of Elam and Media, that God was preparing to use for one of the most remarkable acts of deliverance and restoration in the entire Old Testament. The stage was now set for Persia to step onto the center of God's historical stage. One of the most astonishing things in the Bible is how God uses people you would least expect. He often chooses leaders from outside the family of Israel to accomplish his greatest purposes. There is no clearer example of this than Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Persian Empire. Long before Cyrus was even born, the prophet Isaiah spoke of him by name. About 150 years before Cyrus came to power, Isaiah wrote that God would raise up a man named Cyrus who would act as his shepherd. This is a title God usually reserved for the leaders of Israel, like King David. To give this title to a pagan king, a non-Jew, was truly extraordinary. It showed that God's sovereignty extends over all nations and all rulers, not just his own people. Isaiah's prophecy was incredibly specific. He prophesied that God would take Cyrus by the right hand, subdue nations before him, and open doors for him so that gates would not be shut. This is precisely what happened. Cyrus conquered the mighty Babylonian Empire in 539 BC with remarkable ease, famously diverting the Euphrates River to march his army into the city under its walls. The prophecy also explained why God was doing this. It was for the sake of Jacob his servant, and Israel, his chosen one. God was raising up this great Persian king for the specific purpose of liberating the Jewish people, who had been held captive in Babylon for decades. He was an instrument of deliverance, chosen and anointed by God for a special task. The most amazing part of this story is the decree Cyrus issued shortly after his conquest of Babylon. The Bible records this decree in both the books of Ezra and 2 Chronicles. Cyrus announced that the Lord, the God of heaven, had given him all the kingdoms of the earth and had appointed him to build a temple for him in Jerusalem. Therefore, any of the Jewish people living in his empire were free to go back to Judah and rebuild the house of the Lord. This was a complete reversal of the policies of the Assyrians and Babylonians, who deported conquered peoples to break their national identity. Cyrus, guided by God, did the exact opposite. He believed that allowing people to return to their homes and worship their own gods would create a more stable and loyal empire. This act by Cyrus was a direct fulfillment of prophecy, not only from Isaiah but also from Jeremiah, who had foretold that the Jewish exile in Babylon would last for 70 years. At the end of that period, God promised to visit his people and bring them back to their land. Cyrus's decree in 538 BC marked the end of that 70-year period right on God's schedule. It is a powerful testament to God's faithfulness and his absolute control over history. He used a Persian king, a man who did not know him personally in the beginning, to fulfill his covenant promises to Israel. Cyrus became God's shepherd, gathering the scattered flock and leading them back home. The return of the Jews to Jerusalem was not a single event but a long and difficult process, and the support of the Persian kings was crucial every step of the way. The initial wave of returning exiles led by Zerubbabel faced immediate opposition. The local inhabitants of the land, the Samaritans, were hostile to the rebuilding of the temple. They used intimidation and political maneuvering to halt the construction for many years. It was a time of great discouragement for the Jewish people. They had returned home with high hopes, only to see the work grind to a halt. It seemed as though God's plan was being thwarted by human opposition, a feeling many of us can understand in our own lives when we face obstacles. However, God had not abandoned his people or his project. He raised up two prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, to encourage the people to resume the work. At the same time, God moved in the heart of another Persian king, Darius the Great. When the local governor questioned the Jews' authority to rebuild, they told him about the original decree made by Cyrus. A search was ordered, and a scroll containing Cyrus's decree was found in the archives at Ecbatana, the Median capital. King Darius not only reaffirmed Cyrus's order, but went even further. He commanded the local governor to stay away from the work and to provide funds from the royal treasury to pay for the construction costs and the daily sacrifices. This was an incredible turn of events. The very government that the enemies of Israel were trying to use to stop the work now became its primary sponsor. Darius decreed that anyone who altered his edict should have a beam pulled from his own house and be impaled on it, and his house made a pile of rubble. This was the unchangeable law of the Medes and Persians at work, this time in favor of God's people. Because of this powerful backing from the Persian throne, the temple was finally completed and dedicated in 516 BC, amidst great joy and celebration. The Persian Empire acted as a protective shield, allowing Israel to restore its spiritual heart and center of worship. The story of Persian support did not end there. Decades later, under King Artaxerxes I, God raised up two more leaders, Ezra and Nehemiah. Artaxerxes gave Ezra, a priest and scribe, a letter granting him authority to return to Jerusalem to teach God's law and establish a judicial system. The king also provided him with silver and gold from the royal treasury to beautify the temple. Later, when Nehemiah, the king's cupbearer, heard that the walls of Jerusalem were still in ruins, his heart was broken. King Artaxerxes saw his sadness and not only gave him permission to go and rebuild the walls, but also provided him with letters to the governors for safe passage and an order for timber from the king's forest. This sustained support from multiple Persian kings over many decades shows a pattern of divine favor, orchestrated by God to restore his people and their holy city. Within the period of Persian rule, we find one of the most dramatic stories of deliverance in the entire Bible, the story of Esther. This book is unique because the name of God is never mentioned, yet his hand is clearly visible in every single event, moving behind the scenes to protect his people. The story is set in the Persian capital of Susa, under the reign of King Ahasuerus, who is widely identified as Xerxes I. He was a powerful but volatile ruler. The story begins when he deposes his queen, Vashti, for disobedience and launches a search for a new queen. A young Jewish orphan named Hadassah, known by her Persian name Esther, is chosen for her beauty and grace to become the new queen of the Persian Empire. Esther's cousin and guardian Mordecai instructed her not to reveal her Jewish identity. This detail becomes critically important as the plot unfolds. Meanwhile, a wicked and arrogant official named Haman rises to a position of great power, second only to the king. Haman demands that everyone bow down to him, but Mordecai, as a faithful Jew, refuses to bow to any man in that way, reserving his worship for God alone. Infuriated by this perceived slight, Haman's pride turns into a genocidal rage. He doesn't just want to punish Mordecai, he convinces the king to issue a decree to annihilate all the Jews, men, women, and children, on a single day throughout the entire Persian Empire. The date was chosen by casting lots, or pur. This was a moment of existential crisis for the Jewish people. Their complete destruction seemed certain, sealed by the unchangeable law of the Medes and Persians. Mordecai sent a message to Queen Esther, telling her that she must go before the king and plead for her people. This was a terrifying prospect, as anyone who approached the king uninvited could be put to death. It is here that Mordecai speaks his famous words, "And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" He recognized that God's providence had placed Esther in the palace for this very purpose. After calling for a 3-day fast, Esther courageously decided to risk her life, saying, "If I perish, I perish." Esther's wisdom and courage, guided by God, turned the entire situation on its head. Through a series of divinely orchestrated coincidences, a sleepless night for the king, the reading of records detailing Mordecai's past loyalty, and a perfectly timed sequence of banquets, Haman's evil plot was exposed. The king, enraged, had Haman executed on the very gallows he had built for Mordecai. Because the original decree could not be revoked, the king issued a new decree, empowering the Jews to defend themselves against their enemies on the appointed day. Instead of being a day of destruction, it became a day of victory and deliverance for the Jewish people. This great salvation is still celebrated today in the festival of Purim, a lasting reminder of how God used a brave queen in the heart of Persia to save his covenant people. The book of Daniel gives us a unique and supernatural perspective on the Persian Empire. Daniel served as a high-ranking official under the Babylonian kings and continued his service into the Medo-Persian period. His visions provide a prophetic blueprint of the sequence of world empires, and Persia plays a central role. In one vision, Daniel sees a ram with two horns, one higher than the other, pushing westward, northward, and southward. The angel Gabriel explains to him that this ram represents the kings of Media and Persia. The two horns symbolize the two peoples, and the higher horn that grew up last represents the Persians who became more powerful than the Medes. This vision accurately foretold the nature and direction of the Medo-Persian conquest. Daniel's visions go beyond just earthly politics. They pull back the curtain to reveal the spiritual warfare taking place behind the scenes of human history. In one of the most remarkable passages in the Bible, Daniel has been praying and fasting for 3 weeks, seeking understanding about a vision concerning the future of his people. An angelic being, likely Gabriel, finally appears to him and explains the reason for the delay. He says, "The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me for 21 days. This prince was not a human ruler but a powerful demonic spirit assigned to the Persian Empire, seeking to influence its policies against God's purposes." The angel was only able to break through after Michael, one of the chief princes and the guardian angel of Israel, came to help him. This incredible account reveals that the events on earth, the decrees of kings, the movements of armies, and the fate of nations are deeply connected to battles in the heavenly realms. The Persian Empire was not just a political entity, it was a spiritual battleground. Demonic forces were actively trying to thwart God's plan for the restoration of Israel. At the same time, God's holy angels were fighting to ensure that His will was done. This gives us a much deeper appreciation for the favorable decrees of Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes. These were not mere acts of human kindness. They were victories won in a spiritual war, secured through the prayers of faithful people like Daniel and the power of God's angelic messengers. The angel's message to Daniel also contained a prophecy about the end of the Persian Empire. After explaining the spiritual conflict, the angel tells Daniel that he must return to fight against the prince of Persia, and that after him, the prince of Greece will come. This foretold the rise of Alexander the Great, who would conquer the Persian Empire just as Daniel's earlier visions had predicted. This demonstrates the breathtaking scope of biblical prophecy. God revealed to Daniel not only the spiritual dynamics of the current empire, but also the sequence of future empires. It shows that God is the Lord of history, fully aware of the spiritual battles and in complete control of the rise and fall of earthly kingdoms, all to accomplish His ultimate plan. While the Bible often portrays Persia in a positive light as a protector of Israel, it also contains sober prophecies of judgment and a future, more sinister role. The prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel, who ministered before and during the Babylonian exile, spoke about the nations surrounding Israel, and their words included judgments on the people of Elam, the ancient inhabitants of what would become Persia. Jeremiah delivered a specific prophecy against Elam, stating that God would bring 4 winds from the 4 quarters of heaven and scatter the Elamites. He promised to bring disaster upon them, to send the sword after them, and to set his throne in Elam, destroying its king and officials. This was a prophecy of a devastating military defeat and dispersion. However, as is often the case with God's judgments, the prophecy did not end there. Jeremiah's message concludes with a word of hope. After the judgment, God says, "But in the latter days I will restore the fortunes of Elam, declares the Lord." This is a crucial promise. It shows that God's ultimate purpose is not destruction but restoration. Even for a people facing severe judgment, God holds out the promise of a future return and blessing. This dual message of judgment and restoration is a pattern we see throughout the Bible. It reminds us that God is both just and merciful, and His redemptive plans often extend far into the future, to the latter days. The prophet Ezekiel also speaks of Persia, but in a very different context, a great end-times alliance that will come against a restored Israel. In chapters 38 and 39, Ezekiel describes a future invasion of Israel led by a figure named Gog, of the land of Magog. Gog leads a massive coalition of nations, and listed among his primary allies is Persia. This is a shocking turn. The very nation that once facilitated the return of the Jews and the rebuilding of their temple is prophesied to one day join a confederacy bent on their utter destruction. This prophecy places Persia in the camp of Israel's enemies in the last days, a stark contrast to its historical role as a benevolent protector. This prophetic shift is profoundly important for understanding God's long-term view of history. It teaches us that the political and spiritual allegiances of nations are not fixed. A nation that is a friend in one era can become a foe in another. The role Persia played in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah was part of God's plan for that specific period. The role it is prophesied to play in the end times is also part of his sovereign plan, a plan that will ultimately lead to a dramatic display of his power and glory when he intervenes to save Israel from this great invasion. These prophecies from Jeremiah and Ezekiel provide a balanced and at times unsettling picture of Persia's destiny in the biblical narrative. When we look at the complete biblical testimony concerning Iran, we are faced with a fascinating and important paradox. On the one hand, the Persian Empire is presented as a servant of God, an instrument of his gracious will. God called its founder Cyrus by name and anointed him as his shepherd to liberate the Jewish exiles. For over 2 centuries, the Persian kings provided the political stability, financial resources, and legal protection necessary for the people of Israel to return to their land, rebuild their temple, and restore their national life. The empire became a safe haven where, as the story of Esther shows, God could perform a miraculous deliverance for his people. This role as a helper and protector is unique among the Gentile empires mentioned in the Old Testament. On the other hand, the prophets paint a darker picture of Persia's future. Ezekiel's prophecy of the Gog and Magog war clearly identifies Persia as a key member of a military alliance that will seek to annihilate Israel in the last days. This positions Persia as an enemy of God's people in a future eschatological conflict. This dramatic shift from a benevolent protector to an end-times adversary is a powerful lesson in and of itself. It demonstrates that a nation's relationship with God and his purposes can change over time. No nation has a permanent status as good or evil. Its alignment depends on its choices, and its role in God's unfolding historical drama. This duality should cause us to look at nations with biblical wisdom, understanding their potential for both good and ill. How can we reconcile these two seemingly contradictory roles? The answer lies in the absolute sovereignty of God. God is the ultimate ruler of history, and he raises up nations and brings them down according to his own perfect timing and for his own purposes. He was able to use the pagan Persian Empire to fulfill his covenant promises to Israel in the 6th century BC. In the same way, he is able to use a future Persian alliance to fulfill his prophetic timeline for the end of the age. The Bible does not present this as a contradiction but as a demonstration of God's complete control over the affairs of mankind. He is the potter, and the nations are the clay in his hands. This paradox is not just about Persia. It is a lesson for all of us. It shows that God's plans are complex and multi-layered. He can use the same person or the same nation for different purposes at different times. The story of Persia reminds us not to put our ultimate trust in any human government or political alliance. Kings and empires rise and fall, but the word and purposes of the Lord stand forever. Our focus must remain on him, the one who sits on the throne and directs the course of nations. He is the one who turned the heart of Cyrus, and the one who will ultimately judge the armies of Gog, demonstrating his power and glory to all the world. The biblical journey of Iran from the ancient lineage of Elam and Madai to the prophecies of the last days culminates in one profound truth: God is in control. He is the sovereign Lord of history who weaves the stories of all nations into his grand redemptive plan. The story of Persia is a powerful case study in this truth. We see God preparing a people for centuries, raising up an empire at precisely the right moment, and moving the hearts of pagan kings to show mercy and favor to his chosen people, Israel. He orchestrated the return from exile and the rebuilding of the temple, fulfilling his promises to the letter. This shows us a God who is intimately involved in the details of human affairs, working all things according to the counsel of his will. Even the prophecies of future judgment and conflict serve to highlight God's sovereignty. By foretelling Persia's role in the end times invasion of Israel, God demonstrates that the future is not a mystery to him. He knows the end from the beginning. This knowledge should not lead us to fear, but to faith. The same God who prophesied the conflict also prophesied its outcome, a divine intervention and a great victory that will cause all nations to know that he is the Lord. The story of Iran, therefore, is not ultimately about the goodness or wickedness of an empire, but about the faithfulness and power of God, who directs all nations toward his ultimate purposes. we must not forget the promise of restoration that is woven into this narrative. The prophet Jeremiah, after pronouncing judgment on Elam, promised that, in the latter days, God would restore their fortunes. This is a promise of hope for the people of Iran. The Bible shows that God's heart is for all peoples. The same gospel message that went out from Jerusalem is for the descendants of Elam and Madai today. God's plan of salvation through Jesus Christ is open to every person from every nation, including Iran. The story of Persia in the Bible is not just an ancient history lesson, it is a living testament to God's desire to draw all people to himself. Therefore, as we reflect on Iran's long and complex biblical journey, we should be filled with a sense of awe at God's magnificent plan. He is a God who keeps his promises, who can turn the hearts of kings, who wins spiritual battles, and who holds the future in his hands. His story with the people of Iran is not over. The promise of restoration for Elam still stands, pointing to a future day when many from that land will find their hope and salvation in the God of Israel and his Son, Jesus Christ. This is the ultimate message of the Bible for any nation. Despite the twists and turns of history, God's sovereign hand is always at work, offering redemption, restoration, and a place in his eternal kingdom.